Dr. Luarkie helps us understand what is the right to free, prior, and informed consent, also known as FPIC. FPIC is the global authoritative framework on the rights of Indigenous peoples and is founded in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, also known as UNDRIP. While the UNDRIP itself is not legally binding, it serves as a legal framework for the minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of the Indigenous peoples of the world. After initially opposing the UNDRIP, the United States formally endorsed it in 2011, citing its commitment to serving as a model in the international community in promoting and protecting the collective rights of Indigenous peoples, as well as the human rights of all individuals. Dr. Luarkie is the executive director of the Native American Mining and Energy Sovereignty Program, the NAMES Initiative, which launched in August 2023 as a part of the Payne Institute for Public Policy, aims to help carve a new path forward by supporting the self-determination of Native nations, fostering dialogue, and advocating for more collaborative partnerships. As the name suggests, Native sovereignty is the initiative's primary focus, the starting point for any and all conversation about energy, mining development, and finance on Native lands. Thank you so much, Dr. Luarkie, for joining us on this episode of the Future of Energy podcast. We're so happy to have you here.
Thank you.
So jumping right into it, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? What attracted you to the topic of Native American rights and future and past mineral and energy developments?
I don't know if Native American rights has been the driver for me as much as it has been our opportunity and obligation to do better. And in that, I, at least from my community, and I always say, if you know one tribe, you know one tribe, we're all different. But we're taught that we don't have rights, we have responsibility. And so I think the rights thing is a foreign concept. That's a European concept. Ours is a responsibility. And so in that frame of mind, I look at how we as Native nations can begin to utilize our sovereignty differently. I think recently we've used it as a tool of protectionism versus empowerment. I believe sovereignty gives us our ability to self-determine, but we need to move to significance, and significance demonstrates our capacity to execute, to implement. And so in saying that, in this day and age of energy and economy building and reimagining what we can be going into the future, it's really inspired me to draw back on those cultural lessons, community lessons of how do we take our communities forward, utilizing the gifts of our Creator. And those gifts are everything from the minerals, everything that's in the earth, everything that's on the earth, everything that's around the earth, including ourselves, to work collaboratively, to coexist in a manner that is constructive to all. Because the minerals, they have a purpose, so do we, but we have to use each other properly. And so for me, those are some, I guess, more philosophical or foundational reasons as to why I've chosen to go this path. And I think right now, we have a lot of Native Nation students, professionals that have the capacity, that have the talent, that have the skill sets. And we have to find a way to bring that talent to be utilized in our home communities. As you're aware, almost 2/3 of Native Americans across the country live in urban areas. They don't live on tribal lands. So how do we bring that talent to help our local tribal homes? I think that's really important. And so I think from this perch of being able to, have access um, to the academic institutions, having access to industry, having access to tribes, how can we bring, if you will, a team of rivals together to build an industry and build a future that is second to none. And always keep in mind that who we work for, and we're working for those that are waiting to come into this world. And we want to make sure that we bring them into a world that has even more opportunity than we have, is safer, but we've also created an environment for a better humanity than we've been. And so those are the things that in a kind of a broad stroke kind of way, but also trying to go a little deeper in my why. Those are my thoughts. And
Yeah, that was wonderfully said. And could you tell us a little bit more on how you got into the energy developments, and what was it like getting elected as the tribal governor of Laguna Pueblo community?
well, and again, as I said, our tribes are all different. Some tribes have electoral systems, pure electoral systems like the US, counties, states. And then you have the other extreme where you have, like here in New Mexico, we still have many traditional governments where they're appointed by the traditional leadership. So you don't spend a penny, campaigning or anything. As a matter of fact, if you do any of that stuff, you're pretty much shunned. You're That's not our way, of serving. Laguna, we have somewhat of a hybrid system in that normally you don't just come out of the woodwork and decide to run for governor or anything like that. They bring you through a process through different lower offices, and they groom you up to that. And there's a reason for that. That for the individual, you get to know the community, our issues, our land, and all those kind of things. The other side of that is the people get to know you. Is this a person that we should take to the next level? Is this a person that that will do what needs to be done for the larger community, so on and so forth? But also, is this a person that can work on the outside as well as internally? So we have a 2-year terms, and so every 2 years, we have a nomination process, and the people in the community, we have our community meeting, and they select who is going to go on the ballot. The persons can't, like I said, we don't have a system where you declare candidacy. You can't campaign. So like I said, if you do those things, you're pretty much shunned. That's not, because it's not about you. It's not, it's so they say it in our language, it's like self promotion, like promoting yourself, and that's not ours. And so even once your name gets selected and your name at that point, once your name is out there, and you accept that nomination from the people, then it transitions into the ballot system, where then it goes on the ballot. So even at that, you still can't campaign, you still can't do any of that stuff. It's totally up to the people. So in a long-winded way to answer your question, it's not something we're taught to pursue. It's something that the people prepare you for. So it's a different model. So and a lot of the times you can say no, but that's also not looked at very well either. They expect you because they groomed you, to be in that role. So the experience, though, is once you get into the role, is really not much different than any of these other mainstream positions. You still get the arrows in the back. You still end up with people disagreeing or upset with you, even though you may not even know the person. So you get all those same political elements. But I think the beauty of it, though, is you have a profound opportunity to really move a community and a people forward. And so the energy part, our tribe, Laguna, at one point was one of the largest open pit uranium mine in the world, the Jackpile-Anaconda mine that ran from 1952 to 1981. And when when the mines were in operation, we were pretty much at full employment, not only our community, but surrounding communities. When the mine closed, we went to about 72% unemployment. So it was a devastating hit to our community. Um, but energy, has been a significant resource for our tribe. And I always say that our leaders, in the 50s, when they started the mining or decided to go into the mining, they were thinking about me, and I wasn't even born yet. And what I mean by that is as governor, I had the opportunity to look at council minutes from many years back, including that time when they were debating as to whether or not to enter into mining. And a lot of the conversation was about how do we provide for our community? How do we do for our people? Safety, I know in this day and age, safety and environmental and all those kind of things are really, really big issues. But we also have to keep in mind that the safety elements were not promulgated until the 1970s, around mining. And we were already 20 years into it. So that was not an element of conversation during the 50s. Not that safety wasn't a concern. There wasn't the science, there wasn't the backdrop to it, right? So going back to why I believe they were thinking of me before I was even born, our tribe went from having a few $1,000s in our tribal accounts, to having several million by the end of the 50s in a matter of 10 years. And the community, based on the council minutes, said basically, divvy up the money, write us a check, and we're good. But the tribal leadership took a stance that said, we're not going to do that. We'll give you some, but we're not going to do that in its entirety. Instead, we're going to create investment accounts. One of those investment accounts was a scholarship fund. And so in the late 80s, early 90s, when it was time for me to go to college, my bachelor's was paid for from those mining revenues. So, and including a lot of other tribal members. Mining and an energy has been a challenge for our community, but it has also been a benefit. So leapfrog into this day and age, I see that right now, we, as well as several other tribes across this country, recognize the huge challenge that the new administration introduces or presents, but we also recognize the unprecedented opportunities. And I think energy becomes the catalyst for that, for tapping and unleashing that unprecedented opportunity for tribes. And so that's what is exciting me, because it brings opportunity not only for the obvious things like economics, cleanup of our lands through reclamation and remediation, but also getting into the supply chain, getting resources into the supply chain. But I think from a capacity building, it allows an opportunity for advancing research and science around minerals and energy. And it allows opportunities for tribes to transition, transform, and transcend from being the researched to being the researchers. So I think that's a huge motivation for me.
Yeah, that was wonderfully put. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and so just to segue a little bit, but the noted American writer Wendell Berry in Unforeseen Wilderness, which he wrote in 1971, I'm going to quote it exactly. He said, "We can learn about."
Rochan, I can barely hear you. Can you speak a little bit more?
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now? So the noted American writer Wendell Berry in 1971, in his book Unforeseen Wilderness, he wrote that we can learn about it from the exceptional people of our own culture and from other cultures less destructive than ours. I am speaking of the life of a man who knows that the world is not given by his fathers, but borrowed from his children, who has undertaken to cherish it and do it no damage, not because he is duty bound, but because he loves the world and loves his children. So this sentiment is sort of sometimes associated with Native Americans and stewardship, environmental stewardship. Can you share with us your philosophy on being stewards of the Earth's natural resources? or natural resources.
That sounds like an interesting book to begin with. Heard of that book, but I love to read, and so I'm gonna have to look that up. Recently that's a topic I've began to delve down into and think about more around this topic of stewardship. And what I mean by that is when you look at pre-contact with the Europeans, the Spanish, or whomever, the native nations had pride, they had inherent ownership, if you will, of the lands, of the resources, of the knowledge, the traditional knowledge, the trading, the trade routes, all those kind of things. We saw the Indian Wars, we saw all these kind of things go on, and we fought for our land. People died for our land to protect our resources. But where my head scratching has come in a little bit, though, is where in this journey did we transition from being owners to being stewards? Where did we transition from owning the garden to being the gardener? And was it because of all the eventual policy and doctrines and statutes or whatever that came into play once the U.S. Congress was established that diluted our inherent ownership? Like I said, our ancestors died for our land. They died for a culture. If they had the idea of stewardship way back then, would they have died for stewardship? And so I think we need to reimagine and revisit that concept of when did we become stewards and no longer the owners? It's kind of there's a, I hope I say it right, but the Desmond Tutu, right? When he was talking about when the colonizers came to Africa, he said when the colonizers came, they had their Bibles, we had our land. They said, let's close our eyes and pray. When we opened our eyes, they had our land, we had their Bibles. And that's kind of what I see what happened in this transition. We closed our eyes and we went from owners to stewards. And so I think, we're at a time of reimagining sovereignty. I was just reading a letter that went from the various tribal organizations to the Trump administration. And in that letter, it talked about the federal policies, laws, and funding that help to shape sovereignty and self-determination. I'm like, what? Right? Because if it's inherent, then that statement of federal laws and funding helping to shape it is contradictory. And so I think we're at a point in time where we have an opportunity to transform our thinking back to being owners, back to being focusing on the balance sheet, not just the income statement, creating real value. And so in saying that, I think, when you're an owner, you have a different mentality and relationship with what you own. When you're just renting, you have a different relationship with what you rent. And so I think when it comes to the environmental side of this, there's an inherent connection to the land, to the environment, to the cosmos. But we've somewhat, in some instances, and I can't just take a broad stroke, but I say in some instances, we've diluted that inherent relationship with the idea of stewardship versus owning the relationship. And we need to revisit that, because I think that we have an incredible opportunity to build a world, like I said earlier, that is going to be even more advantageous for those that are waiting to come into this world. And when I say those waiting to come into this world, not only our children, but the plants that are going to be new plants that are going to be growing, new animals that will be born. How do we create that environment that is going to be conducive to all of us? So it's probably a long-winded way to answer your question, but I think it's a much more complex question than just how do you do environmental management, and how do we look at stewardship, right? Because we have to consider this idea of ownership. And so taking back, I guess for lack of a better word, control of our destiny is crucial. And, you know, one of the things I would use as, I guess, as an example is this year, or maybe, I think it's this year, it's like the 50th anniversary of the Public Law 93-638 Indian Self-Determination and Indian Education Act, right? As the name implies, to try to become more self-determined, self-governing. A lot of that is allowed or enabled by grant funding. But when you go after grant funding, the irony of this is that the worse off you are, the better chance of funding. They don't fund success. So in saying that, I think it's really, really important to think about how do we redefine and recast self-determination. And like I said, I think I said it earlier, you know, self-determination establishes a right to, or sovereignty establishes a right to self-determine, but being significant demonstrates our capacity to implement, to execute, to truly be sovereign. And that, to me, it all ties together. It's an equation. It's like, it's not 1 + 1 = 2. It's how can we create an equation where 1 + 1 is greater than 2. So it's more of a chemical equation versus a mathematical equation, where it's an absolute outcome versus a reaction or an impact. And I think that's how we need to reimagine environmental stewardship or environmental ownership, all those kind of things.
Okay, thank you.
Wonderful. Yeah, you were recently named the director of Native American Mineral and Energy Sovereignty Initiative at the Payne Institute for Public Policy at the Colorado School of Mines. Can you tell us a little bit about the NAMES initiatives and its goals?
Sure. And actually, it's Native American Mining and Energy Sovereignty, not minerals. But yes, it's been a really interesting and an exciting opportunity with the NAMES program at the Payne Institute at the Colorado School of Mines. I feel like a kindergartner there, you know, because it's all of the above when it comes to energy. It's not just one. It's not just fossil fuels. It's not just renewables. It's everything, right? And it's been so very exciting to me. Also being around, you know, the academics and the industry people that are experts in these areas. NAMES is really, even though the name has in it mining, it's not promoting mining, but it's promoting coexistence, solution development. How do we work? How do we coexist in finding solutions? Whatever is most relevant and palatable to a community, let's try to help that happen. Convening these crucial conversations, but also thought leadership in the production of papers, research papers, white papers. We also have the NAMES symposium. This year will be the second annual that will be held at Southern Ute tribe up in Ignacio, Colorado. They hosted it last year, and we're so fortunate that they've agreed to host it again this year. It'll be May 20th and 21st in Ignacio. But it's that type of work of bringing industry, academic, tribes together to have these conversations, to see the success stories, not to focus on what's wrong, but to focus on what's right. How can we make this, how do we move this industry forward? It doesn't mean we ignore the atrocities of the past, because I think in order to have a clean energy future, we have to have a clean energy past. So we have to clean up a lot of the atrocities of the legacy issues that have been created between tribes and industry. So So the names program is really about bringing that type of impact, bringing that type of opportunity to tribes to convene that are interested in this space. So that's what I think. Not I think that's what I um, would say about what the names program is, and our goals really um, aren't fancy, aren't sophisticated. It's our goals are really making impact with tribes, being a resource to tribes, and being a convener for tribes. And so and supporting what they desire as that envisioned future in energy.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Well, Dr. Luarkie, I was very fortunate enough to attend that first conference in Ignacio and enjoyed it very much. The kind of challenge that you were mentioning, you talking we to have a clean energy future, and there's an awful lot of critical minerals deposits that do sit on or near native nations in the western part of the United States that there's a lot of interest in mining in the future. So that clean energy future you talked about, but we don't have a clean energy past, right? We have, I mean, your community lives next to a lot of uranium tailings pilings from that mine that was never really properly cleaned up or addressed. Um, so in a sense, to reimagine, as you're talking about, to go from maybe a not such a good history, and because certainly it's not, into a better future, a better, I said, reimagining sovereignty, reimagining ownership, reimagining all the rest of this. For a long time, the kind of the European, the federal government, the white Anglo view of the relationships with native nations, it was almost as if they saw the federal government saw the nations as children, and there was a very paternal, set of regulations around this. I, one of the professors, I guess is Professor Dominic Parker, who was at that first conference with the Hoover Institute of renewing indigenous economies at Stanford. He talked about the concept of white tape, essentially maybe an extra set of bureaucracy that kind of has gotten in the way of hearing the native nation's voice, and not only treating them as equal, but treating them as the owners of these resources. How do we be more optimistic? How do we create a better future? How do we create ways of collaboration and engagement, of bringing people, all the stakeholders together to create a better future?
Well, I think with the Native nations, it's getting them to the table right from the beginning and not seeing them as an afterthought. I think that's one major first step. Just get them to the table, have the conversation. There are things like the free, prior, and informed consent process that these organizations go through or companies have to go through. But the thing that for me, I always think about is we're trying to have free, prior, and informed consent and come to some solution, but we don't even trust each other yet. I think there needs to be work around trust building first. And you start that by getting the Native nations to the table, include them in the car. Here's what we're trying to do. Right. I think the other part of this is, as we look at building out these opportunities, I think Native nations also have some work to do. And what I mean by that is the paternalism type policy and framework, really relates to tribes and the domestic dependents under the trust doctrine of 1831, we're wards of the court, if you will. That's where the paternalism comes in. But also in that same definition in the US Constitution, references tribes as domestic dependent nations. We have to start to ghost the domestic dependent and start focusing on the nations. Native nations, we need to start behaving like nations. We have to start using different language. And I don't see anything wrong with having resources, come from the federal government in the way of grant funding. But we shouldn't be 100% reliant on them. That's not sovereignty, that's dependence. And again, I recognize there are some of our native nations that have not had the ability to have access to markets or to certain resources. So there's not much of a choice. But I think in order to move away from this paternalism and look at how do we become nations, if you will, it is really going to cause us to transform our thinking. We have to look at things differently. We have to even refer to ourselves differently. We have, again, every tribe is different, but like in our tribe, in our language, we don't have a word that directly translates to mean poverty. You can describe it, but there's no word that directly translates to mean poverty. There's also no word that directly translates to mean failure. You can describe it, but there's no direct word. And where I'm going with that is we come from strength and abundance, not deficit and weakness. The paternalism reinforces that we have deficit, that we're weak, so they have to make the decisions for us. There's policy after policy that has been written for Indian country by some person sitting in Washington, D.C. that has never, ever stepped foot on tribal lands. But they're writing policy for us. So this is why I believe this is a time of transformation. This is a time and an incredible opportunity. In crisis, there's opportunity. And I think we're at one of those moments. So I think those are going to be some of the cornerstone elements of work that need to be done to move away from this paternalistic model, to reshape our, not government to government, but our nation to nation relationships. We need to be talking about not economic development, but economic integration, not assimilation, integration, economic systems. And so I believe that we also have to be able to have the type of conversation of always understanding, who we're discussing, what's in it for them, right? And how do we help that, but also demonstrate it what's in it for us. So I think those are going to be some very interesting, essential discussions that need to happen soon for Native nations to really move forward and really capitalize on this energy movement, because I believe that the Native nations can be an incredible, powerful ally to the United States. And there's Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, right? I use that as a metaphor to say, I mean, you have 574 nations here in the US and 575 of the US. Talk about a wealth of nations just right here. We can't do everything at once, but maybe we start with energy to start building that wealth of nations.
Well, I think, sitting in the audience in Ignacio and hearing all the speakers last year, from Native nations, from industry, mining industry, and from the federal government, there was a noticeable difference in tone of voice. I mean, the Native nation speakers seemed to be authentic and almost spiritual in some of their describes. It was pretty obvious the industry just could tell you what they wanted. I mean, then what their value was with regard to that. So, in a sense, that was an honest way of describing expectations. I was disappointed in many of the federal speakers because they seem to be still in the past, still not up to this fact of, so they were inviting you to the table. Well, in a sense, it was your table. So why did you have to get invited in the first place, right? Kind of some of your other kind of things that not all of the stakeholders were still thinking the same way. So an opportunity to to challenge some of these things to move forward. But I think a lot of it, as you said, the Native American nations needed almost to respond to the authority that they have, to the sovereignty that they have, and not wait for it to be given, but to assume and take over, and that it is theirs. And then the collaboration is more equal.
Mhm.
Mila, next.
Yeah, there was a recent study published in the Nature Sustainability that found 45% of mining projects globally are located on or near indigenous peoples' lands. In the United States, 79% of lithium, 68% of cobalt, and 97% of nickel, and 89% of copper reserves and resources in the US are located within 35 miles of Native American reservations. With all of the potential new mining projects that are being evaluated now, are Native American voices being heard?
You know, I would hope so. And I couldn't I couldn't say, with any background right now to say that they are. And I think that's why the creation of a initiative like the NAMES program is so very crucial to make sure that we can bring those voices forward, and making sure that those voices also come forward with capacity and competency. Because mining it's a unique industry, right? I mean, not you can't just find somebody walking down the road, walking down the street with a mining background that can go talk with miners or mining companies, right? In any level of competency or coherence, so including me, so I think that I've seen mining companies like, there's Freeport McMoran. Um, uh, I've seen and had some really great conversation with representatives from Resolution Copper, from New Range, Copper and Nickel, that are really making efforts to work with tribes to make sure their voices are heard. We need more of those kind of companies. We need more of those kind of partners. And I'm not saying that there's perfection in those conversations and that everybody is balloons and ice cream and puppy dogs at the end of the conversation. There's still some real hard topics that need to be talked through and thought through. But those types of companies are at least having the ability, the courage, the willingness to sit down and have those discussions. So I believe it's happening. I just think it probably needs to happen more, and we need to have some illumination on what these companies are doing already that have been successful.
Perfect. Thank you.
Well, I just want to kind of go back to a point that you've already brought up in terms of our energy past, our legacy, and obviously your uh, reservation with the Jackpile mine, when it was one of the world's largest open pit uranium mines for those 30 years or so history that you talked about. And it was a big one. I mean, it's nearly half the uranium supply in the United States for nuclear weapons in the Cold War came from that mine, um, or at least in the Grants mineral belt and the deposits around the central New Mexico. But that wasn't left in a very good shape for your community. And the responsibility of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Bureau of Land Management, et cetera, really, I would say, failed their responsibility with regard to the afterlife of the mine. I know you have some thoughts on the idea of turning a not very good legacy into maybe new opportunities and circular economic development or an economic sustainability around it, or dealing with what is there, the reality, and trying to move forward. So how do we take that history and turn it into something better?
For me, that's it's a very intriguing, exciting, but also close to my heart opportunity, because I mean that's my home, right? I now have grandchildren, but right now, like, the reclamation that was done was more of an engineering reclamation, and that it covered up the tailings and did the erosion control, but that's about it. It doesn't have an environmental remediation where the land is going to be put back into use, where our children, our grandchildren's footprints can be made and water can be used. I think that we need to think about this in the context of the land that raised us. We need to give back to her now. We need to clean out those elements that will allow for those footprints to be made in the future. We might not see the shade of the tree, but maybe our great grandchildren will, and so I think there's a huge opportunity for a community to come together, but it's going to start with a community conversation. Do we even want to have the conversation? And how do we not only start it, but how do we move it forward so we get to that point of actually cleaning the land that raised us? I see huge opportunity, education, economically, so on and so forth. So I think right now that's probably one of the most, for me, heartfelt opportunities that I see before us, for our tribe, and that is the circular economy, taking what's left, the tailings, cleaning that up, recycling them, getting benefit out of those things, and then what can't be used, figuring out where does that non-usable waste go. Really, the waste to value model.
I think the idea is a little bit of his patience, so that obviously some of the mining companies want to start working tomorrow, right? And yet the whole conversation hasn't been done. Some started, as you acknowledge, the rest of that, but you have to balance some of this introspection, trust building, with the impatience of the economic model of when to start digging now. Mila?
Yeah, Dr. Luarkie, I saw your message in the chat that you have another call soon, in a few minutes. Jim, do you want to just jump to the last question? And
Yeah, why don't you go to the last?
okay, perfect. Well, Dr. Luarkie, thank you so much for your time today. Before we leave, is there anything that we forgot to ask you that you think is important to share with our audience?
I don't think there's anything that you forgot to ask. I mean, but what I think is important in going forward is keeping these types of conversations going, starting new conversations, and that this isn't a conversation about us versus them. This is a conversation about how do we prolong our lives? How do we prolong the earth? How do we prolong the environment in a manner that would allow us to all coexist responsibly, constructively, healthy, but also recognizing things like, the elements like critical minerals, right? That's always an issue, but realizing the very technology we're talking on right now requires critical minerals, requires copper, requires lithium. We wouldn't be having this conversation without it. Getting an X-ray, getting chemotherapy, that requires radiation. We need to understand those things. And I think from a humanity side, those things that are in the earth, again, the minerals, water, whatever, those things that are around the earth, the wind, the sun, we as humanity, when we don't understand our roles, we cause those things to fight. That's what's happening right now. I see a lot of these conservation groups causing these fights, but they both have a purpose to work together, not fight. And I hope that we as humanity can stop causing the fight and start finding a way for those elements to coexist so that we all benefit. It's that we all need one another. And when I say we, I'm talking about the elements, the land, the plants, the humanity. We all need each other. So I would just close with that, and that again, it's not a conversation about us versus them. It needs to continue to evolve into a conversation of collaboration and working together for a better humanity and a better future.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Richard. This has been a fascinating, sort of conversation. And I very much hope it's the beginning of a continued one. I work with you at Payne Institute, and your uh, time here where we talk to our USC audience. So thank you. This has been really important, and for you to take the time up it's been special. We really been honored by your presence.
Well, one thing we took away from Dr. Luarkie's conversation is that he's been driven by the opportunity and responsibility to be better.
Yeah, and something really important I think he said was, if you know one tribe, you only know one tribe. We are all different, and we're not taught that we have rights, and we're taught that we have responsibilities. I thought that was a key takeaway from this.
He said that the rights thing is a foreign concept. It's a European concept and not something that they've been using in their culture for a long time.
As Native nations, we use the sovereignty differently, not as a protectionism, but as empowerment to self-determine.
He said that we've been given the gift of everything that's under the earth, on the earth, and around the earth, including ourselves.
And as we heard, almost two-thirds of Native Americans live in urban areas and actually not on reservations.
He said that we must think of who we work for. It's not for our ancestors or for our current bosses. It's for those who have not yet arrived on this earth.
And one of the good examples was, the Jackpile-Anaconda mine, which was one of the largest uranium mines in the country. But when the mine shut down, there was 72% unemployment on Laguna Pueblo reservations. And tribal leaders in the 1950s thought of future generations. And so their focus was, part of the investment was really towards education. And Dr. Luarkie's college scholarship was from that mining royalty fund.
He got the opportunity to go from being the research to being the researchers.
Absolutely. And something that he said, how he said that we need to revisit the idea of when did we go from being, the owners to being the stewards, which was what he's asked, from being the garden to the gardener.
A quote from Desmond Tutu is that when the colonizers came, we had our lands and they had their Bibles. They said, "Let's close our eyes and pray." And when we opened our eyes, they had our land and we had their Bibles.
A really, really important quote. And something that was mentioned was how there was a point in time of reimagining sovereignty and how, the focus needed to be on the balance sheet and not just the cost revenue statement. So there was an inherent difference between the relationship of something you own versus something that you might rent.
Taking back control on Native American destinies is crucial.
And when you go after grant funding, the worse off you are, the better your chances to get the grant. And they don't really fund success.
He said that we need the capacity to implement and execute, not 1 + 1 + 2, but 1 + 1 is greater than 2. It's a chemical versus math equation.
Absolutely. And, the free, prior, and informed consent from the UN declarations on the rights of Indigenous people provides a framework for how to work together. But now, there's not a lot of trust, and we have to start there. And he said that, quote, we must start acting like nations.
We don't have a word that translates to poverty or failure. We come from strength and abundance and not weakness and dependence or dependence.
And something that he mentioned was the importance of talking about economic integration and not development and not assimilation as well.
He sees our world as a wealth of nations. It's the US plus 564 native nations.
And something that really important, he said, was it's not a conversation of us versus them, but one of collaboration to make a better future. One of the benefits of the NAMES initiative is a scholarship for a Native American student pursuing a graduate degree in an engineering discipline at the Colorado School of Mines. In our next episode, we get a chance to talk to Kiara Billy, the first recipient of this scholarship. Miss Billy brought along her friend, Alex Brunson, another Native American graduate student, and we had an amazing conversation about their path to the future of energy.
Yat she kiar Billy and Shia at Sitnajini Nishlin, Sanjikine Bushes Chin, at Torachini Dashache and Tohana Dashanele. Thank you for having me, and my name is Kiara Billy. I'm Dene, born for the Blackstreak Wood Clan for the Cliff Dweller people, and my maternal grandfather is Bitterwater Clan, and my paternal grandfather is near the Water people. And so what brought me to mines for electrical engineering was my mom. Both my parents are mines alumni. And so, of course, naturally, it would be my turn to eventually come to mines as well. My mom had me when she was 19, while my dad worked. And so he kind of deferred his degree so he could work and support me and my mother. And then later on, he got his degree, and then eventually I found my passion for engineering throughout the years.
And my name is Alex, and I am Muskogee Creek, and I am originally from Montana, and I was born in California, but I kind of moved all over the place. And before coming to mines, I worked for a water department in Granby, Colorado, in a small mountainous community. And in that position, I had to wear a lot of hats and play a lot of roles with the local community. When I'd go from having to be down in a ditch and wrenching on a pipe to having a meeting with the mayor just the next moment. And I was meeting all of these engineers as we were building this new water department for the area through a large grant at the time. And as I was meeting these engineers, I was asking everyone, how did you get into your position? How did you find your position? Your life sounds so exciting in terms of your work. And as I was asking the engineers how they got into their position, I realized that I didn't have a degree or anything. I hadn't gone right to college. I was after high school. Where I went to high school is about 20 minutes east of Idaho and on the Canadian border, and there's not a lot of opportunity. So I feel like people become complacent and just adopt the idea that we're going to enter the workforce. But for me, I didn't know what that initially had looked like until I moved around some and bounced around. The attraction for Colorado naturally was the skiing and the outdoors. But I stayed once I found a passion, or I found like there was a path opening itself up to me. So I threw my hat in the ring, and having never stepped foot on a college campus, was going to school online and decided to apply to mines to transfer in. And I was initially applying for the hydrology department because that was my background. However, I found geophysics to be this space where there was a lot of intersection and opportunities of all these other disciplines and all these other ways to look at other disciplines. And so I completed my geophysical engineering degree at Mines after transferring in. And it wasn't easy because I was the first generation to go to boarding school or to go to college because my grandmother was in Indian boarding schools. And as a product of that, she gave up my father for adoption. And there's a large disconnect from that Native heritage. And my mom passed away. My mom is white, and she passed away when I was about 4. So I'd always had this tie to this Native culture. So when I was doing my doing my undergraduate degree, I realized that I could find this space where I was able to look at this intersection of geophysics and indigenous knowledge and cultural reclamation. And that's what led me to wanting to do my humanitarian degree with geophysics and looking at the underpinnings of indigenous oppression and how we can engage through geophysics as a tool towards reclamation and towards efforts of reconciliation as we're trying to move forward in this new chapter.
Thank you so much for joining us for the future of energy. Special thanks to each of our guests today and to our technical wizard, Abhi, for his important contributions to this episode. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast so you can automatically get access to all our new episodes. You can find us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts.